Dr. Graff, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on from where you are joining us. My name is Dr. Genevieve Graff, and I will be giving you a brief background for today's webinar and go over some housekeeping items before turning the session over to our moderator for the webinar. I am currently beginning my 4th year as an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington in the School of Social Work. In this position, I engage in research that's related to understanding structural sources of disparities in access to quality and effective health and behavioral health care. On behalf of the 13th Grand Challenge of Social Work National Steering Committee, I'm excited to say welcome to our guests who are joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. Today's webinar is the 6th part of a 7-part series dedicated to the 13th Grand Challenge, Eliminate Racism. Because this is the newest of the Grand Challenges with a focus on the urgent crisis of racism in society, the National Webinar Working Group has organized this series to highlight why eliminating racism should be a lens from which to view each of the other 12 Grand Challenges. We had our series launch in June with our esteemed speaker, Dr. Patricia Reed Merritt, who gave us a strong charge to continue the work, no matter what the challenges are ahead. Our second webinar focused on the grand challenges of promoting smart decarceration and achieving equal opportunity and justice. We are excited to hear from experts on the ground in Harris County, Ohio, as they work to eliminate racism in these 2 areas of the grand challenges. Our third webinar offered us a critical dialogue on actionable policies and practices within agencies designed to reduce economic inequality. Our 4th webinar gave us perspectives on the importance of elevating the voices of individuals experiencing homelessness. And last month, we heard from activists on the ground in New Jersey to talk about the movement towards anti-racism and climate and technology access. And today, we are excited to be leaning into the grand challenge of closing the health gap and advancing long and productive lives. We hope that today you get a snapshot of tangible examples of how we can eliminate racism in these grand challenge areas. As we've asked in previous webinars, let us commit to first listen and then engage with one another today for what we hope will be an instructive session. Of course, there are just a few housekeeping notes to ensure everyone has the best experience. First, we are excited to have 2 audiences, one on Zoom and one through YouTube, so we will engage with them both during this webinar. Second, all Zoom attendees can communicate and interact in the chat box. Zoom attendees do not have the ability to speak or go on camera. For questions and answers, the Zoom attendees, you can answer your questions through the Q&A feature on the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Attendees will also have the ability to see questions submitted by other attendees. If someone has the same or a similar question, you can upvote the questions, and this will allow me as the moderator to determine which questions are popular amongst the audience, because we will only have about 10 minutes for Q&A today. The Q&A feature is a separate feature from the chat box, so be sure to enter any questions that you really have to have answered by the speaker in the Q&A feature. YouTube attendees, you can answer your questions. You can enter your questions or your thoughts in the comment section under the live video, and we will also be monitoring these questions and read them live. So that's it for housekeeping. Now I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists and pass the baton over to our moderator for the panel, Dr. Dale Magloglang, who is a member of the webinar working group. First, we're going to have Mike Spencer, who is a University of Washington presidential term professor and acting associate dean of academic affairs in social work. And he's the director of Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Oceanic Affairs at the University of Washington Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. He is of Native Hawaiian mixed race descent. His research examines health and wellness amongst Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders and other BIPOC populations, and is focused on interventions that promote health through Indigenous practices and values. He is a fellow of the Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare and the Society for Social Work and Research. And he serves as the co-chair for both the Eliminating Racism Grand Challenge and Close the Health Gap Grand Challenge. Next, we'll have Jessica Ramirez. She is a first-generation Chicana college student from Oxnard, California, and is currently a PhD candidate in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington. Growing up, she personally experienced and witnessed her family, friends, and community being marginalized by a myriad of social injustices. Because of these experiences, Jessica became interested in how communities of color heal from trauma directly inflicted by systems of oppression like racism, white supremacy, and colonization. Toni Camacho is a queer Chamorro PhD student, born and raised in Guyana, currently attending the social welfare program at the University of Washington. His experiences as a queer and indigenous Chamorro and a community-based participatory researcher have driven his passion to enact meaningful change through the development of policies and intervention that promote the health of QTPI and other Pacific Islander communities. Santino's research seeks to examine the health disparities of QTPI and the integration of cultural resurgence and survivance into health promotion for their communities. He uses community-based research grounded in indigenous Chamorro and Pacifica values and ethics to develop theories, interventions, and policies that promote cultural resurgence and the development of community-grounded services for QTPI. Next, we'll hear from Dawn Belkin Martinez, who's a clinical associate professor and associate dean for equity and inclusion at Boston University School of Social Work. She's a founding member of the Boston Liberation Health Group and the co-author of the book Social Justice in Clinical Practice, a liberation health frame for social work. Finally, we'll hear from Taylor Goyette Frechette. She is a racial justice practitioner, facilitator, and clinical social worker. She's currently working as a trainer and a project coordinator for Mass General Brigham's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, where she designs, implements, and oversees racial equity training for the healthcare system. Prior to joining Mass General Brigham's Office of DEI, she served as faculty for the Racial Reconciliation and Healing Project manager for the Racial Justice and Equity Initiatives at the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center, and as a domestic violence advocate at Brigham and Women's Hospital. At the core of Taylor's racial justice work is Ubuntu, the African proverb that says, "I am because you are." Recognizing that her liberation is bound to others is fundamental to her commitment to undoing internalized racism and eradicating structural racism and inequities. Dr. Dale Maglalang, he will take over now.
Thank you, Dr. Graff. So I think we'll have our first group of speakers, which are speakers from the University of Washington, Dr. Michael Spencer, Toni Camacho, and Jessica Ramirez.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank the faculty here at the University of Texas at Arlington for their organization of this webinar series for eliminating racism. As the co-lead for both the Eliminating Racism and the Close the Health Gap Grand Challenges, I have been thinking a lot about the integration of these two areas. And so I'd love to not only present some of my perspectives, but today I have two very special guests that represent the next generation of this research in the future. But before I begin, I'd like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. As a team from the University of Washington, we'd like to acknowledge that we stand on the lands and waters of the Lushootseed speaking and Coast Salish people, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Tulalip, Puyallup, and other Coast Salish people. I also want to acknowledge that I pay real rent and I live on these lands, and you can learn more about that at this website. And I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous people, past, present, and future of the lands that all of you live on. I'm committed to creating space for all Indigenous and BIPOC communities, and I do this through my mentorship, my teaching, my research, and my service. And with that, I'd like for us to begin by talking a little bit about this integration of health and racism. I'm going to infuse a little bit of Indigenous epistemology into this from my own community, the Kanaka Maoleo Native Hawaiian community. So when we talk about health, we usually use the term ola, which is holistic and not just representative of our physical health, but actually the relationship between our mind, body, and our spirit, and all of the components that we interact with within both the social as well as the physical environment, including land and all living things. So to us, health is more than just living. It's about thriving, it's surviving, it's recovering, it's healing, and this is true for many communities of color. So with health, we look at the balance then of mind, body, and spirit. However, on the flip side, we consider illness to be something derived from what we call ma'i, or imbalance. And so within our community, our culture, it's the healer's role to find that source of imbalance or ma'i in order to correct it. And I believe that this is our social workers who are the healers in this role. So as we think about racism is ma'i. It is imbalance. Racism, both interpersonally and structurally, strikes at the very source of our ola, or our health. It is perpetuated by societal norms that are centered on whiteness and white privilege. It exists everywhere, including those organizations in which social work is quite prominent. While many of us in the field of social work, especially our white colleagues, are only beginning to learn about the extent to which ma'i exists within individuals and systems, as well as the extent to which they are enacted through policies and practices. Our BIPOC communities have known for a long time about this ma'i. We have been fighting it without rest. And we have been working on solutions that are grounded in our cultures and in our communities. And we are continuing to do that. And as evidence of how we are continuing this effort, not just in my generation, but in future generations, I have two special guests, which are two doctoral students that were introduced earlier. And I will start off with turning the floor over to not doctor quite yet, close, but Ms. Jessica Ramirez.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, not doctor yet, but maybe soon enough. Hi, everyone. Welcome. The title of my presentation, part of the series, is A Step Towards Healing for Communities of Color. And I want to mention that, again, what Dr. Spencer has mentioned earlier, that communities of color have been doing this work, right, for a very long time. And so I hope that we recognize that this is also nothing new, but just a step towards something greater. And so if we can go on to, can I? Yeah. And so I know that Dr. Spencer shouted out folks. And so I want to shout out the organizers, the panelists for being here with me today, just my support system in and out of the University of Washington, of course, my Oxnard community back home. And I know that we acknowledge the homelands of the Coast Salish homelands, but I also want to acknowledge that I and currently on Kalapuya lands, which is now Beaverton, Portland area. And so again, I'm a guest on these lands, and it's very intentional about standing in solidarity with Indigenous folks and communities. And so one thing I want to mention before I get into the details of this work is who I am in this work, right? And so I think it's very important to talk about my positionality, because it not only impacts me, but it impacts my friends, my family, my community. And so I think it's a point to make that, one, I'm a first generation Chicana college student from Oxnard, California, a predominantly Latinx, predominantly Mexican city. And so growing up in Oxnard, California, there's, like many other cities around the country, lots of injustices, right? And I just named a few here, but things like hyper-policing, inadequate schooling practices, the lack of mental health and substance use services were prevalent in my city, right? And I bring up that point, and we can move on to the next slide, which is, that I'm going to use hyperpolicing as an example. And all of these, and I'm sure you're sitting here thinking about like, I can name so many injustices right in this moment. But for me, hyperpolicing is one that I'm going to use as an example for this, is that a lot of these injustices that we, as scholars, as community members, as social workers, that we're researching, thinking about, working with, is that they're all derived from racism, white supremacy, colonization, right? All the systems of oppression. And so I think about how in my community, and which got me into this work of social work, which is that the hyperpolicing was so prevalent that college was an exception for folks in my community, right? And so you start seeing like folks researching on the school to prison nexus. We see high suspension rates, right? And so as I'm thinking about this as a first generation graduate student, is that like, okay, how can I work on the work of hyperpolicing? How can I dismantle these systems, right? And so then I started thinking about like, what are the health outcomes of this, right? And a lot of social work, and I bring this up because a lot of social workers and folks in other fields as well have been looking at the health outcomes, right, of racism and colonization, and how that impacts young folks, how that impacts communities of color. And I think I could be confident to say, I feel confident to say that I think we have a good grasp that these systems of oppression lead to poor outcomes, right? We know that it impacts us. And I think, to be honest, you can just ask any BIPOC folk, like we're living proof that this impacts us, right? That this impacts us negatively. And so one thing that I've moved within my research is we know that these systems of oppression impact us. So how are we actually healing from them, right? And Dr. Spencer alluded to this, and we're going to see later from other folks, including Toni Camacho, which is this healing aspect, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about how does culture play a role in this, right? And we have culturally sustaining mental health practices. Culturally sustaining comes from Dr. Django Paris and Dr. H. Samuel Alim. And then we have healing-centered engagement, right? Dr. Sean Shinwright, my bad. And so in thinking about this, like, I want to move towards thinking more and more about healing. And the last thing I want to say is that about this slide, which is that this doesn't only have to happen in academia, right? This is just some of the work that I've been doing, but then I want to share one last example of what I've been doing in my community, right? In this project, I'm a MFP fellow, and so this project was actually funded by the CSW MFP, so just kudos and shout out to them, because this project wouldn't have happened without them. And so one thing I want to mention is that this project, La Cultura Cura, which is a popular phrase used by Latinx folks to describe how culture is healing, right? How your culture heals you. And it's not to say that there's any, that's the only way to heal, right, is through culture. But I think it's one big aspect that I've been finding, that I've been talking to folks, me, myself, being in a predominantly white institution, how that has healed me in different aspects. And so I, myself and other folks, did this community project in Oxnard, California, surveyed community members and talked about, like, what does La Cultura Cura mean to you? Right? How does your culture heal you? In what aspects is this healing? You know, we're going through a lot of stuff. And if you saw on my first slide, you would have seen that there's a mural that Oxnard youth made, and it talked about a whole COVID-19, and talked about anti-Blackness, right? The police brutality. And so in thinking about, like, how are those things healing for folks? And so we got local artists to take their responses and turn them into art to pass them out to community members. And so that's just a little bit of research, but also community things that we can do together to start thinking about healing. And I'm gonna pass it over to Toni Camacho. Thank you.
Hafide Toru Hamzu, everyone. My name is Toni Camacho, or Santino Camacho, my government name. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Washington, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about queer and trans Pacific Islander health, or QT Pie health. Next slide. Next slide. So I wanted to start off to discuss sort of the role of settler colonialism in QT Pie health. And settler colonialism has institutionalized and normalized heterosexism, homophobia, and transphobia within a lot of our cultures and our political systems, and Western values as well. It's led to the epistemicide of different identities and roles, specifically different QT Pie identities and roles within our communities. It leads to the erasure, policing, and possession of Indigenous culture and identity, and the loss of cultural practice, protocols, land, and connections to our ancestors. And this, in turn, leads to negative impacts on health. So I wanted to talk to you about a study I did. It's a community-based participatory research project where we did 12 semi-structured interviews with Washington QT Pie folks. We worked collaboratively with members from Gumagela, queer Chamorro art collective based in Seattle, and Utopia Washington, which is a nonprofit organization that does health services for Pacific Island QT Pie in the Puget Sound area. And this was a quote from one of our participants. She said, "I think our people's history points at the ways in which we can extend our lineage. And I don't think that we're there yet. To realize that queer children can also be an extension of your lineage. In Washington, there's just this aura in the air and the energy that you feel that it's okay to be who you are and to be with the person that you choose to be with. That's contributed so much to my mental, emotional, and spiritual health." Next slide. So here are some of the results from our study. QT Pie conceptualized their health as feeling whole, specifically that their mind, body, and spirit were in harmony. This is sort of around the holistic health literature, mind and body being sort of the mental and biological processes, and spirit being more connection to culture, ancestors, and land. And that these relations were shaped by cultural and social norms influenced by settler colonialism. They noted that practicing their cultural values and traditions were important to improving their health. And most importantly, they noted that agofli'i and alofa were really critical to improving their mental health and their ability to feel whole. Agofli'i is a Chamorro term meaning I love, like love, to value, meaning love. But more specifically, it's like I see you. And alofa is a core value in Fa'a Samoa, which is the Samoan way, which is like a set of values that sort of guide relations in Samoan community. And future direction. So here's where my work is going next. Next slide. So I'm going to move more into looking at defiant indigeneity. Defiant indigeneity is a theory developed by Dr. Lenny Tevis, who is a Kanaka feminist scholar. And she looks specifically at settler colonial systems and the ways in which settler colonial systems and Western hegemony shape Pacifica indigeneity, specifically Kanaka Maoli indigeneity. She notes that defiant indigeneity is this practice and resistance to the ways in which settler colonialism defines indigeneity. And I'm going to look specifically at QT Pie cultural resurgence and survivance, and how we're resisting that through our culturally resurgent practices, and how does that support our health in the future.
Thank you very much, not only to all of you out there, but to our two wonderful speakers. And I just want to close with this slide. If you want to learn more about our grand challenge, you can go to closethehealthgap.com, or you can go to the Grand Challenges website, which is also linked to this page. And with that, we'll say thank you so much, and we'll look forward to hearing your questions.
Great, thank you to the University of Washington team. So yeah, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now we'll have Dr. Dawn Belkin-Martinez from Boston University.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. And first, thank you so much to my compañeros and compañeras y compas that are fellow panelists, people for organizing this. I'm going to be talking about a radical model of healthcare practice, which is called Liberation Health. And it's usually, we wrote a book about it, and there's a day-long workshop, and I'm just going to be talking to you for 15 minutes. So think of this as a little antojo, a little taste of what Liberation Health is. The first thing, that I wanted to share is that, and I'm going to see if I can set this so you can see the whole slide. Can you see the whole slide? Yeah. Hopefully, okay. Is that for Liberation Health, it's not neutral, right? We say that, well, you can't be neutral on a moving train, quoting Howard Zinn, that things are already moving in a deadly direction, and to be neutral is to accept that. So Liberation Health is very clear that we're not neutral. And what we believe is that racial capitalism is killing people daily. We don't think that's up for debate. We don't think there needs to be more studies about this. There needs to be healing. And over the past 30 years, the United States, like the rest of the developed world, has experienced the havoc of racial capitalism. And I think, you all know, in housing and healthcare and the criminal justice system, people's lives, it's just devastating. So the question then becomes, what is to be done, right? What do we do about this? And I think for those of us that are clinical social workers, and I am a clinical social worker, one of the challenges is, how do we address, things like racism, sexism, all the isms that impact our health so profoundly in the setting, in the clinical setting. And some people have said that it's challenging to do it in a clinical setting. What we say is that we need a model to do that, to instruct social workers. And that's what Liberation Health is. It's a theory of human behavior that conceptualizes that the problems of individuals and families cannot be understood in isolation from the economic conditions that give rise to them, right? The economic, social, political conditions. But more important than that, it's a method. It's a specific method of practice that helps individuals, families, and communities understand the personal, cultural, and institutional factors that are contributing to their problem and act to change those conditions, to liberate people from both internal and external oppression. And what I like to say, borrowing from the Brazilian theater of the oppressed theorist Augusto Boal, is that our goal in Liberation Health is to challenge the cop in the street and then the cop in your head, right? That's impacting your mental health. Just a little bit about the beginning of Liberation Health. We sort of developed the model after spending some time in Brazil, learning from Paulo Freire, and then working with the families that were sort of liaisoning with on our inpatient psychiatry unit at Children's Hospital. So as you know, the people that are the most directly affected by injustice should be leading and developing the models, right? And that's what happened with Liberation Health. We work with families over a period of close to 5 years in defining, really developing our instrument, developing the methods, being able to sort of come up with a model that worked for them, and intervention specifically. And
Dr. Martinez, sorry, I think your screen froze. I wonder if you could reshare it if possible.
Oh, so let me see. So the screen, sorry about that. Can you see it now?
Yes, yep.
Okay, so I think what I'll do is I'll need to just advance the slides like this, like manually. Okay. Can you see the
that works.
Yes, thank you.
I'll just be advancing manually. So these are the 5 theoretical frames that Liberation Health draws from. The first one is Paulo Freire, and his work on popular education. The second one is Ignacio Martin Barro, the Salvadoran psychologist, and liberation psychology. The third is our very own Bertha Keepan Reynolds and the rank and file movement of radical social work practice. The fourth is the work of Antonio Gramsci and cultural hegemony, basically understanding worldview and ideology. And 5 is Black feminism and intersectionality, referencing the work of the Compagnie River Collective. I just wanted to sort of talk about some of the major concepts of liberation health. Again, I'm giving you a real antojo because there's a lot more detail. But the first one is understanding your historical moment, right? Understanding where you are, where you're situated, what's going on in the historical moment. The second one is understanding worldviews. That's from Antonio Gramsci's work, Understanding Ideology, White Supremacy, right? Capitalism needs white supremacy to keep it going, understand those dominant worldviews and subordinated worldviews. The concepts of oppression and objects and subjects. Paulo Freire had probably 200 pages about objects and subjects. And then the concept of liberation and transformation. I wanted to just review worldview for you. When we think about worldview or ideology, it's really important to understand that dominant worldviews that come from the people that have the interests of the dominant class in society, those ideas are not neutral. They reflect the historical moments and ideas and beliefs of the dominant class, right? So many of us internalize those ideas, right? And our goal as liberation health therapists is to sort of identify those dominant worldview messages and deconstruct them. The second concept that I wanted to review real briefly is Freire's ideas about objects and subjects, right? And he basically says that the more oppression you've experienced, the more likely it is that you will feel like an object, that the world acts upon you, right? Things happen to you. And the goal of liberation health is to, I mean, obviously no one's totally an object and no one's totally a subject, but his premise was that the more oppression you've experienced, the sort of, the more difficult it will be for you to sort of feel like you have agency, right? And he's done a lot of work on that is outlined in his seminal book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So the goal of liberation health really is to transform the object-like experience that we have due to ideological messaging, real institutional injustice, and transform that into a subject-like experience. And again, if I could reference Augusto Boal, that is about transforming both the external world and the internal world. So we're battling the cop in the street as well as the cop in our heads. And how do we do that? Liberation Health is a very simple methodology. It's about seeing the problem, right, in its totality, analyzing the problem, the personal, cultural, and institutional factors that influence the problem, and then acting to change the situation. That methodology came from the families that we're working with. So when I'm seeing someone as a clinical social worker, like one of the things that I like to do is to sort of have a real sense of the problem that are getting in the way of people functioning in their optimal way, right? And so people make a list of problems and we sort of, we parcel out that list and come up with one thing we're gonna focus on. The most important thing, I think, is the problem analysis. And that's about analyzing not just the personal factors that are affecting the problem, but the dominant worldview ideologies around race, class, all those sorts of things, and the institutional factors, things like the school system and the healthcare system and the legal system and so on and so forth. And so what that involves is looking at personal factors, right, which are pretty easy for people to recommend, to understand. Those are sort of the medical model, but it's the cultural factors. And when we say culture, we don't mean the food you eat or where you're from. We're talking about, again, ideological messages around race, class, gender, individualism, competition, ableism, consumerism, things like that. And then the step 3, right, which was developed by the families, is to come up with an action plan. You know, what's the problem, what needs to change, long range visions, and actually a very concrete plan for the week. So we're working on sort of both like, how do we change our external world and how do we challenge the dominant worldview messages that are oppressing us? Okay, so the interventions around that, there are 4, right, that can be used with any other kind of mental health intervention that you're using or any theory. The first one is identifying the dominant worldview message. The second one is deconstructing the message. The third one is introducing new information and consciousness raising. And the fourth one is rescuing the historical memory of change. So we know, right, to challenge systems and to create an anti-racist world, we need to do it in community, right? And that means being part of a larger group. I'm part of the Boston Liberation Health Group, which is actually not just in Boston, it's all over the country. There are all over the world, there are over 2,300 members. And we have three purposes: to train people in this radical social work practice of clinical work, to support people that are doing this work, and to act politically in the world. And so that involves a lot of training. We train people all over. We have a big training at the University of Maine on Friday. We've been to many universities, hospitals, local institutions. Here we are doing the triangle at Hunter, right? It involves scholarship, which writing about this, presenting about this, dialoguing with communities about this. I'm not sure where we are here, but I think it's some university talking about how to do the liberation health and adjust it, right? And then, introducing new information. Is anyone here a hip hop fan? If they are, that's Rick Ross right there. And we are talking with him. And one of the things that we like to do is to partner with community agencies to sort of study how political education and organizing is a mental health intervention. We have a big study that we're doing right now with the local group of BIPOC youth, the group that's run by BIPOC staff, and we're super excited about that. So yes, that is our theory. We think of liberation health as a theory, a method, and a movement. And these are some of the different agencies that we've worked with. And there's many more. And I'll be more than happy to answer specific questions from people during the question and answer period. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Don Balkan-Martinez. And if, like Dr. Don Balkan-Martinez said, Liberation Health is all over the country, so please join in Boston. I've been able to join one of the meetings, and it's a great learning space. So now we'll have Taylor Goyette-Frechette present.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see it?
Yes.
Thanks, Dale. So as Dale said, my name is Taylor Goyette-Frechette, but if there's any Beyonce fans anywhere on Zoom or YouTube, please call me Tayonce. Just wanted to start off with that. And racially, I'm Black. Ethnically, I am French Canadian and African American, and I use the she series pronouns. And today I'm so excited. I'm going to talk to you about a project that really changed my life. It is called the Racial Reconciliation and Healing Project that is based here in Boston. And before I get started, I just need to acknowledge the youth on the title of this screen. This project works with youth in the greater Boston area. It's been running for over 10 years now. And these are a group of youth that I worked with about 4 or 5 years ago now. And they're now all about ready to graduate college. But I just really wanted to honor the people that are in the project and doing the work that I'll talk more about. So here are the founders, Denny Butler McKay and Abigail Ortiz. They're both based at the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center. Denny is a clinical social worker, and Abigail is the director of community health programs there. And these two are my mentors. And Racial Rec, as we all call it, the mission really is to guide youth to have connections with themselves, with their peers, and ultimately the world. We believe that the power is in relationships. And with this, we provide them framework on understanding intersectionality, the history of racism and white supremacy, and how that's really shaped our current policies and practices in the United States. And an important part of this work also is to help youth learn how to regulate their emotions, right? We teach them racism and white supremacy, this is what it is, this is how it functions. And then if we're not giving them tools on how to then regulate their emotions around that, sometimes we could feel like that's a setup. And so then we really talk about their role in dismantling racism. So that's kind of an overview of what racial rec is. And yes, all of the pictures in here are going to be of the youth. And so I'm a little dysregulated because I love them and miss them so much. So enjoy the pictures. There are 3 core elements to the framework of racial rec. And the first core element is radical democracy. And that is the belief that every system in the United States is rotten at the roots, right? It was all built upon white supremacy, structural racism. And it assumes that racism, a system of advantage based on race, operates through policies, practices, systems, structures that work in tandem, right, with other forms of oppression to maintain white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy, the big 3. And why this is important is it's really easy for us to focus on interpersonal racism, especially in social work, right? For the clinical people, I found in my training that it's really easy to focus and zoom in on interpersonal racism and how to get people to be nicer to each other. And so we want youth coming in and faculty, because we also train adults in this model. Anyone coming in already with the understanding that we are not here to talk about interpersonal racism. We're here to talk about structural racism. Are you okay with that? Are you down with that? Because that understanding that it's foundational, right? Understanding that racism is structural is foundational to doing the work. And an example of this is one of my colleagues, Karthik Shivashankar, created this timeline looking at the hospitals in Boston when they were developed, just as an example. And social workers or anyone in the room, I really encourage you to do this with whatever system you're a part of. So whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's the child protective system, right? Like whatever system you're in, look at when your organization and other organizations around you were developed. And so just looking, right? Harvard was developed during slavery, MGH during slavery, Boston Children's Hospital, right in between slavery and Jim Crow, Brigham and Women's Hospital during Jim Crow. And this helps everyone to pause, right? If we're not focusing on interpersonal racism, people being mean to each other, that means we're not pointing fingers. So this is to pause, saying, if we already know that racism is structural, and we see that the building we're sitting in right now was developed during, let's say, slavery, then let's just assume that racism is operating here. And once we can all understand that racism is operating here, whether we want it to or not, that's when we can start to engage in the conversation. So that's the first of the core elements. The second of the core elements is head and heart. And what we really want our youth and faculty to understand is that racism, among other things, is a form of trauma that operates generationally and in our everyday context. And oftentimes it's easy to forget that racism is trauma. And so, especially us being in an academic space, right? And me being a part of a healthcare system, we love doing research and we love trying to solve things with our head. And research is super important, but we cannot forget about the heart, right? We need to engage the heart in the process, because if racism is trauma, you can't think your way out of trauma. There's heart work that needs to be involved. The third of the core element is roles. And here, this framework understands that white people and BIPOC folks have different roles within racial justice work. And we really truly do believe that while the trauma is more acute and health harming for BIPOC, white people have lost a connection with their hearts and bodies as well, one that must be mended in the process of liberation. And with that being said, white people are directing to other white people, right? In the early education and the discovery and the understanding that, and the aha moments of, oh, wow, racism is operating here. Okay, what does this mean for me? And also to work with other white people of how they've internalized white supremacy and superiority. What have white people had to let go in order to buy into this idea of whiteness, right? And for BIPOC folks, that really, the racial justice work is working cross-racially and ethnically. And this part is key because oftentimes BIPOC are tasked with doing the early education for white people. We're tasked with trying to prove to white people that racism exists. And that often comes at a cost to us, right? We're sharing painful stories about our own trauma to have white people buy in. And we're not able to have conversations with each other about how we've internalized racism. Because we really do believe that people of color, right, have their own internalized racism and internalized inferiority. And we've heard stuff about each other over time, right? What are the things that we maybe think or say about each other that are rooted in internalized racism? And that's the conversation that we don't often get to have. And so, in racial rec, when we bring the youth in, we do break out into affinity spaces the first Wednesday of every month, where white people do not talk about people of color. They talk about white themselves, being white supremacy culture, their families, their history, right? And for BIPOC, we're in affinity at the first Wednesday of the month talking about what are the ways we've put each other down over time to try to survive, right? How do we heal from that? And then with that, we emerge out of the affinity space being in a place of solidarity where we can co-create and co-design, where if someone says something, right, that offends somebody else, we already have established an understanding that, all right, a white person said something that's a microaggression. Okay, then another white person will probably in that moment say something to them instead of a person of color needing to take the hit. So we just are practicing with them how to operate differently than what they're taught in school or how we learn how to operate, how we survive. So those are the 3 core elements. And I know I talked a lot about the youth, and that's just a brief overview. But I also wanted to bring it into the medical space because racial rec functions in a healthcare system, and I work in a healthcare system. And so Liberation in the Exam Room, also founded by Abigail and Denny, emerged out of an ask from doctors wanting to know, what do I do in the exam room? Okay, great. I understand racism exists. What do I do in the exam room with my patient? And that was the question. How do we bring liberation into the exam room? And this emerged and evolved into Adaptive Leaders for Racial Justice. So it started as a small group of mostly doctors, a few social workers, including me, talking about, right, how do we do it in a clinical setting in the exam room? And then it evolved into Adaptive Leaders for Racial Justice, where we took activities for racial rec and did them with adults, which I will say is way more high risk because adults are not as willing to take risks as youth. And so we were pushed by Abigail and Denny. But in this space of Adaptive Leaders for Racial Justice, after going through, right, after practicing the 3 core elements and really understanding the history of racism and white supremacy and how we've internalized it and how doctors have internalized it, this pre and post survey, this one question about even being able to explicitly name potential areas of bias improved. And so the question was, how likely are you to explicitly name potential areas of bias when addressing your team before seeing a new patient in clinic or rounds? And so before, every day was about 16%, and it jumped to 61% every day people were thinking about that. So bringing it to the front of the cortex and asking the question. And the lesson, and God, sorry, love this picture, love my youth. But the lesson in doing it with these doctors and public health folks and social workers was, it's not working for anybody. What we heard from them, from doctors when we first started doing, bringing racial rec activities to doctors was, okay, I don't understand how you want me to do this when I have to see this many patients, right, within this amount of time, or I'm being pressured by by the system. And so we realized it's not working for doctors. Like, look at the research on their mental health, right? They're not free. And so the work that Abigail and Denny have been doing is working with public health departments in the city, with doctors at different hospitals, with youth, with teachers, in first understanding, how is it not working for you? Where is your skin in the game? And if you can understand why it's not working for you as an individual, that's when we can move forward, because it's not sustainable. Like for the doctors, it wasn't sustainable for them to just say, I need to do better for my patients of color, because they have all the pressures of the system. But if they could understand, like, wow, I'm not happy, I'm not okay, I need to fix this for me, I need to experience what liberation feels like, then that's more sustainable. That's a lifelong journey. And so I really want to leave everyone here with the question, as social workers, how are we participating in the structures of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism? And I will forever, through my journey as being a clinical social worker, or whether I'm working at a systems level like I am now, asking this question, how am I participating in this? So I really encourage all of you to do that, because healed people heal people. And let's get free. And I want to leave everyone with this quote by Adrienne Maree Brown from her book, Emergent Strategy. The strength of our movement is in the strength of our relationships, which could only be measured by their depth. Scaling up would mean going deeper, being more vulnerable and more empathetic. And oftentimes, we're asked to scale things to go wider without going deeper, and that's not sustainable. And so through the work, the most important thing for me has been the strength of the relationships that I have with people. That's how we close the health gap, right? That's how we stay in the journey towards racial equity, racial justice, toward a future we've never seen yet, right? And so I really want to encourage everyone to not forget to prioritize relationships. And it's really easy to get into the busyness of trying to solve the problem. But remember the heart and remember the relationships. And thank you all so much. I so appreciate being here, and I welcome any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Taylor. And I think if you're interested, you can visit racialrec.org if you want to learn more. Taylor and I were both social work interns when Racial Rec was happening, and it's a year-long program, and youth come in twice a week, every day at Southern Jamaica Plain and really do the deep work. So it's a really wonderful program. So we have some great questions from folks that if panelists would be interested in responding to. The first question we have is, can we eliminate racism without dismantling the ideological superstructures of imperialism, colonialism, Western Christianity? Something that we have never addressed intentionally through education in our history.
Okay, I'll break the ice. Well, certainly you cannot, right? I mean, not only do you have to have some awareness of these issues, but you need to also be, having the will to act against them. And that will has to come from those in power. And that's going to be, that's the long-term gain, right? And I think what a lot of us today, I mean, if I had to say what was a common theme here is that, we also need to take care of ourselves, right? We need to heal within our own selves, within our communities, so that we can have the energy to dismantle systems. And we need to build systems of allyship. And I think the educational curriculum that we've heard about today, are evidence of ways that we can teach and grow that movement. So I'll stop there because I think maybe that might have spurred some other potential.
Yeah, to pick up on what Dr. Spencer said, it's about growing the movement, right? There's no way that an individual can do this on their own, and that's in Liberation Health. We say that we need our work as social workers, in addition to this sort of method of radical social work practice, is building the multiracial working class movement for our collective liberation. And that's only going to come by collectively working together, by building the relationships that Taylor talked about, by utilizing the different types of interventions that Santino and Jessica mentioned. So it's all of that work collectively together on the path to liberation.
Any folks want to add on to that? Okay, great. I think we have a question for the panelists again. What has the academic professional reception and response been to these amazing projects that push against white supremacy? Have you seen any pushback?
I can take that one because I've experienced a lot of pushback. I think for clinical social workers in particular, talking about capitalism and racism is not something that at least I was trained to do. Like I was trained very psychodynamically to just sit back and reflect, and hopefully people, will develop this insight, and so it is something that I think people have expressed concerns about, like, wow, you're raising, issues around race, you're raising issues around capitalism. That's not something that the client brought up. Why are you bringing it up? And our response to that is that anytime you ask a question, you're always bringing something up, right? So you're in the hospital and the doctor says, I think you need medication. It's not something that you were thinking about. It's something that the doctor brought up, right? And it may be a very good idea, it may not be, but the point of it is, it isn't any different talking about these sorts of things and talking about what happened with your mother when you were 4 and things. So I think that with the last 5 years, I have noticed a significant change, and that people are much more apt to be willing to have these discussions, right? And they're more open to them. And I think the evidence of that is that we are invited into different social work schools to do trainings on a regular basis.
I'll also add, being in a healthcare system, I often hear like we need to be neutral as a way to push back on talking about racism, patriarchy, capitalism. And my response is always, but we're already not neutral. So when we're neutral, we're going to replicate, right? That's why we have health inequities. When we treat everyone the same, we're still producing health inequities. So we can't be neutral. We just can't. But that's what I hear a lot for pushback within the healthcare system, is that we need to be neutral and we can't pick a side.
Yeah, and I will add to that, as we push even beyond our professional social work, at the same time that we're talking about these issues, there's legislation in many states that are pushing towards, for example, not incorporating, not including critical race theory into coursework or any other information about racial justice, in schools. And so, when you talk about pushback, there's pushback at a lot of different levels. I think when you talk about schools of social work, what I often see is, you see sort of a performative type, behavior where people are very willing to hear about this, talk about it, but the barriers are structural, right? How do you get this funded, right? Can you get tenure, right? Doesn't matter that it takes longer because you work with community. These are the structural barriers within a system that doesn't necessarily support, this kind of work all the time, you know, except for when maybe it does bring in money, or it can serve as a positive advertisement.
Great. Thank you so much to all the amazing speakers. It's been such a, I think listening to everyone was just felt healing. And I think it's great to know that we could reimagine a different social work, right? So I don't know if Dr. Crutchfield, if you have any closing announcements. I know we have one more webinar left.
Yes, Dr. Graff is going to close us out.
Great. Sure. Thank you to all of our presenters. It was great information shared here today. I'm so impressed by the work everyone here is doing. And the models that you guys have all shared, so many different ways to approach this problem and make progress in eliminating racism in order to help close the health gap and advance long and productive lives. I know that there were questions that we didn't get to. Please feel free to reach out and let us know if we can connect you with our panelists so that you can get those questions answered. But otherwise, we want to thank everyone for attending, and especially the UTA School of Social Work for hosting the webinar series, and the Grand Challenges of Social Work for its leadership as well. And I just have to, again, thank everyone on the National Webinar Committee and Grand Challenges. We hope to see many of you at our December 14th webinar, which will focus on building healthy relationships to end violence and to ensure healthy development for all youth. Next month will be our last webinar, and we would love to have you back in December. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.